You better laugh, because otherwise you'll be crying.
Oh, no. Well, I feel bad. Oh, because I was not late that way.
Right.
And him?
Well,
I apologize all the time.
that's the thing, is he probably doesn't
He doesn't know.
know what the hell he's doing. When my grandma was going through all that stuff, it was the same kind of deal. She was never,
How are ya?
never get upset about anything.
Yeah.
She's never seen everything.
So that's what it's got her. It's kind
No. You got to talk about
I jumped the gun, just relax.
Did you guys get a chance to?
Okay.
That was mayor. All right.
Yeah, I can see that. Excuse me.
That's right.
When you said
I didn't even know the way through.
Until you won't become mayor.
No.
You can do it.
That ain't happening.
Well, what do you mean? Why not?
Whenever you're ready.
No.
Well, mine says, oh, my computer clock is slow apparently.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get started then, by golly.
Good.
Do you?
We're glad to see public safety is represented here on the.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start with the joint work session and then move into the city council meeting. Yeah, I'll get there. First thing to do is Sam volunteered to pledge allegiance.
I did. Okay, ready? I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll go, first item is joint work session with the planning commission. Looks like most of you are here.
I know a couple of them are online or watching.
Oh, okay, perfect.
remotely.
Perfect, that'll work. Also, just make mention, we'll excuse Shanna, she had some things come up and wasn't able to make the meeting tonight. We have the property rights ombudsman here, and we'll turn.
Right, well done.
Every now and then I get something right.
That's impressive.
Yeah. All right, we'll just turn the time over to you guys.
That's ours.
Go from there.
Okay.
Should I go over here so they can hear me or?
That would be great, yeah, if you
Stand
would.
at the mic.
Trying to get this started. Let's see.
While we're dealing with the technical difficulties, I'll just say the reason we have these guys here is we're dealing with a lot of land use issues. As you all know, there's a lot of things coming up that we haven't dealt with in the past that we're seeing more and more. And so we felt it was important to get everybody some training and kind of make sure everybody's understands the processes that we need to go through in order to approve or disapprove certain projects and things like that. So I think it's good to always add to our knowledge bank of what we're supposed to be doing up here. So
Awesome. Yeah, we can talk about that tonight.
How would you want me to display this, just as the full screen?
Yeah, that's great. And then,
Okay.
does that work?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure that out, because I've never.
The issues the arrow buttons usually, does that? just work?
Yeah, just to flip between. I just want it to be like just the slide, and I've never, see, it's different now, I must have updated. Do
Are you
know-
not seeing what we see there?
I guess not. Is it the full screen?
Yeah.
Is it just kind of showing you the
Okay.
presentation?
Probably, yeah.
coming up?
We're good.
And you can advance and everything.
Yeah, I've
Okay,
got that side.
great.
Okay, we're good.
So yeah, thank you. Ooh, am I feedback?
you can probably turn it down just a touch there. So
Oh, there we go. Okay. How's that?
Is it okay, Scott?
It's just dictated to me. Whatever
It's
you say
dictating
says
it?
at the bottom.
it is dictating, yeah.
It's, I think that's a PowerPoint feature. That's great.
I don't know how to turn that on.
We'll see how well it does, right? Okay, so, well, thanks for having us. Again, my name is Jordan Cullimore. I'm the lead attorney in the Property Rights Ombudsman's Office. Rob Terry is our statewide land use training director. We know you're here partially by force, right? Because, well, these guys have to have their 4 hours of training.
This does count, by the way.
This does count.
That's good.
But thank you for being here and wanting to learn about this kind of stuff. So if you want to go to the next slide, Katie.
Yeah.
Just to give you kind of a little bit of overview and background of our office, we like to talk about that just because we are a resource. We're a resource to property owners. We're a resource to local government officials. We're a resource to really anyone who has an interest in property rights or land use issues. And these are kind of the 4 areas that we deal with. So our office, we've been around since about the mid-90s. We are a state-funded agency, but our role is to be independent and neutral. So we don't represent the state specifically, right? We like to say that we represent property rights and good decision-making, legal decision-making. And so with that, a lot of what we do is provide just information and education. We get phone calls. We try to have someone available to talk to you, the attorney to talk to you when you call in. If you have questions, we do a lot of negotiation as far as facilitating negotiation. We do mediation in the realms of eminent domain primarily. So when the government needs private property for public use, a property owner can come to us and say, hey, we don't necessarily agree with what the government is offering us for our land. And we can help them by getting an additional appraisal. We can sit down with the parties and we can mediate. And then we also do a little bit of mediation on the land use side. Our primary tool on the land use side for dispute resolution is the advisory opinion. So parties come to our office and either the local government or the property owner can come to us and say, hey, there's a disagreement over how this code should be interpreted or whether or not the city can require us to do X, right? And we can provide an advisory opinion, which is a legal analysis of what a court would say. And that acts as a dispute resolution tool for the parties to try to help them make a good decision. We've done upwards of 300 opinions for the time the office has been around, and they tend to have a pretty good reputation of helping to resolve disputes. So at the end, I think we have our contact information. We have cards as well. But we just want to let you guys know that we're here. And if you have questions, let us know and call in whatever capacity you want, right? You can call us a property owner, you can call us a developer, you can call us a city official, a neighbor, right? And we'll give you just a honest take, right? A neutral take of what the situation is. So you want to go to the next one? Any questions about that, what we do initially? Experiences, good or bad, with the Ombudsman's office that you want to complain to us about? It's time for the airing of grievances.
All good things.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, with that, Rob, you want to jump into this one?
Sure. Yeah. So I had to put this slide in. Jordan was actually the one that showed me this slide a few weeks ago. But I just fell in love with it because I thought it was so perfect. And don't we all honestly feel this way about our private property, right? It can be challenging when there's government regulations and items that are put in place. And especially when you're told, hey, you need to have a permit to do anything with your own property, right? We all remember going to that picture, right? So yeah, that's just to start off with just a little bit of, I guess, like humor, but reality all at the same time, in all honesty. Next slide, please. Okay. So just some of the basics about planning and about land use law. I'm not going to go through, don't worry, and read every single thing that is on this slide. I promise you I will not do that.
And maybe just to give you a preview, we have a few things to go over initially, but we really hope the large portion, the meat of this is going to be question and answer, right? Because we get that you guys have your individual issues that you're dealing with, and we want to make sure to focus on that the most. So
Yeah, we're
this is just kind of laying the foundation.
hit that kind of 100,000 foot level of the items and then really the basics, right? Some of the foundational issues and really some of those state law guardrails. And then move into the conversations about specifics that you guys have. But the foundation for land use law in the state of Utah is the Land Use Development and Management Act, commonly referred to as LUDMA. It's found in Utah Municipal Code 109A. And in general, what it really does is go to set out those standards and regulations that are going to protect the public interest and the public health, while also having in place the rules and the regulations that allow people to utilize their private property, right? So to protect those private property rights, but at the same time to also make sure that they're mindful of the neighborhoods, the communities overall, the regions, and the state, right? Everything together. Next. Okay, some of the basic tools that we have to do that. So first and foremost, you're gonna have your general plan. Your general plan is a mandated document, it's a required document that every community, every municipality has to have. And it sets out your visions and your policies for your community. It's typically a long-range document. Most of them are going to be somewhere in between that 10 and 20-year horizon. Most of them between, I would say, 15 to 20 years, probably a more normal one. The most important part about that is it's intended to be what's referred to as a living document, which means as the needs for your community, the needs, the desires, and the vision that you have for your community changes, the general plan should also be able to change with those items as well. Just because something 10 or 15 years ago may have been the vision that was had for the community, if the needs change, the politics change, anything ends up changing, the general plan should also say, hey, do we still have that compass set in the due north position that we want to go? So it should always be able to be looked at as that living document and adapt for the community as the leaders of the community feel is appropriate. Next. Then you have your land use ordinances. Your land use ordinances, and these are going to be the written laws that have been duly adopted by the legislative body, and they're going to regulate the development in your community and what's happening. These are going to include some of your items like your planning, your zoning, development, your subdivision ordinances, and best practice, of course, for any of the ordinances that you have, they should implement the goals and the policies that are identified within your general plan, right? So as you start moving forward with any of the laws, any of the regulations, you want to always have kind of that North Star as the general plan. Here's the direction we want to go, or the policies that we're putting in place, helping us continually move toward that. And if the general plan needs to change, if there's a desire for that, then the follow-up actions to that, of course, would then be to adjust the rules and the ordinances as appropriate moving forward as well. Next. So zoning is one of those very specific items there. You can see there's a zoning map up there right now. And these are the local regulations that are going to overall manage really the look, the feel, and the operation of your community. They're going to control very important things like land uses, what happens in certain areas of the community, the density, right, the intensity at which a place can build out. You know, how many residential units are allowed in each individual zone, things of that nature. It's the physical dimensions of the development of your community. So a lot of that really has to do with the character of your community. The point of zoning is to avoid conflicts between certain land uses. So the history of zoning really came into play when you started having a lot of people living either right in places where they were working in heavy industrial type of uses, and a lot of the noise, sickness, items of that nature that were crossing over that. That's where the history of zoning really came from. So you started to get more of this understanding of the separation of uses and where that might be appropriate. And over the years, it has ebbed and flowed as you've seen certain things like mixed use become more popular again, and people having an understanding. There are certain commercial activities and residential activities that you like to be able to have some good overlap in those areas if it's the right fit for your community. Whereas the history of it for a long time, zoning was very, very siloed and very, very separated. But you're starting to see some of that flowing a little bit back now. But zoning is a tool that is used by individual communities to make sure that uses are happening in the areas of the community where you feel that it protects the public health and the safety and the overall look and feel of your community. The best practice, of course, for your zoning is that you really want your zoning to implement that general plan, and of course you want your zoning to always be in compliance with the land use ordinances that are being put in place. So you don't want to have any of those conflicting ideas. Next. Okay, so some of the roles and the responsibilities that we commonly see. Next slide. So first, what's the role of a city or a town council? So the city or the town council, they're the body that serves as the decision-making body, often referred to as the legislative body, right? They are the ones that are going to actually write and adopt those laws that are then duly put in place. Some of the actions they're going to take are going to include things like adoption of your general plan, your long-range vision, and any amendments to that over time. They will be the ones that will adopt the land use ordinances, the regulations, and the design standards. And that's both anything that is existing in place right now or anything that is being considered for amendment as well. It's going to be the city or the town council to take the actual approval actions on that. Same exact thing for zoning. Annexation as well, if you're looking to make changes to your municipal boundaries, that's also going to be a legislative action that would be taken on by the city or the town council. And then any adoption of fees or fee schedules, right? Things like impact fees, building permit fees, anything that's going to be a fee out to the community is going to have to be adopted by the city or the town council.
You guys charge impact fees?
Yes.
You're dealing with that?
Next. All right, and then what about the planning commission? Planning commissions are absolutely critical for communities to operate and to operate well, and they are required by the state code as well. However, they operate in an advisory role. So the planning commission is going to review and make recommendations to the legislative body. There are certainly some actions that they can take, and we will talk more about the difference between legislative actions and administrative actions as we move forward in this year. But unless the town council has given that authority to the planning commission, then they're going to be operating in a recommendational type of capacity. So they would simply be reviewing items, making recommendations to the city or the town council to then actually take a formal action on that. You'll notice that the list there is going to be a lot of the same items that the town or city council has the responsibility for, and that is intentional because they're going to be reviewing the same things and making recommendations on those items, comparing it to the rules and everything that are in place. Next. All right, and then what is the role of the land use authority? And you'll note that I put an asterisk next to that because there's now something called an administrative land use authority. So we're going to talk about what that is, some of the differences between the two there, sometimes where they can overlap. But this one is just the land use authority in general, the term land use authority. And a land use authority is a person, a board, a commission, agency, or a body that can include the local legislative body, which means that can include the city or the town council. And that is a group that's designated by that local legislative body to act upon a land use application. So as I've said before, there's going to be some times where those applications by law are set. They'll come before the city and the town council after they've been reviewed by the planning commission and they've made a recommendation. There's then going to be other actions where the planning commission might actually be acting as a land use authority because the city or the town council has given them that authority for certain applications. And so they will then be taking those actions and they do not come before the city or the town council. However, if the local legislative body has not identified another person, board, commission, like said, we want these items to go to the planning commission for them to take action on them, then by default, the city or the town council remains that land use authority. So whenever it isn't given to someone else, it always sits and remains with the town council. Next. Okay, we're gonna have Jordan jump in here. This is where we're gonna get into some of the legalities and really some of the important differences between legislative actions and administrative actions, which is key to everything that happens at the local level.
Sorry, the words are so small.
Yeah, that is, those are.
Okay, thanks. So Ron's done a great job of kind of laying out some of the foundational documents that you guys work on, right? That kind of govern and guide the community, and also the kind of the primary roles and responsibilities. This gets into how you make decisions relative to all of that, essentially, right? Have you guys talked a lot about this, or administrative versus legislative decisions? Do you feel like you have a pretty good grasp of it? We'll jump in like you don't.
I think that's a good point.
Because admittedly, this is foundational, right? To making, we like to say in the Ombudsman's office that making good decisions is making legal decisions that respect people's rights and that also appropriately pursue the public interest, right? Striking that right balance. That's how land use should operate, right? That you're respecting and understanding and trying to pursue the public interest, all the while ensuring that you're respecting private property rights. And understanding what kind of a decision you're making and what kind of the decision-making process should be with those decisions is foundational to land use. So we talk about legislative and administrative. We're going back to civics class here, right? Legislative decisions, as you see up there, involve making laws of general applicability based on the weighing of broader competing policy considerations. So we're talking about implementing or amending your general plan, right? That visioning document, that guiding document, we're setting the policies for the city. And then you implement those policies through your land use ordinances, your zoning ordinances. All of that is legislative decision-making. So the standard, and then you also see other examples up there, right? Annexation decisions. And then in certain cases, if you're entering into development agreements that are making new rules, that's legislative, right? If you're making new rules, then that's a legislative decision, that's a policy-making decision. And the key here is the only entity that can make that decision in the local government is the city council. the elected officials, the people who are accountable to the people, right? But because you're making policy decisions, the courts have largely said, hey, we're gonna stay out of that process, right? So you see the legal standard there. When you make a decision, right, that we're gonna zone this as R110, or we're gonna make the height limit 35 feet for houses, or we're gonna say the setbacks are X, right? Or this is our list of permitted uses. All of that is related to questions about what do we want our community to look like, right? And what do we want the rules to be that govern our community? That's policy making, that's legislative decision making. And so whenever you make one of those decisions, if someone challenges that decision, then the courts will look at that and they'll just ask simply, okay, is this illegal? Is there some state law or federal law that preempts what the cities can do here? Historically, state governments have left, in Utah specifically, have left a lot of that decision making to the local governments. Admittedly, right, they're whittling away a little bit year by year. Most recently, it was with accessory dwelling units, for instance, right? Now, most communities in most places must allow accessory dwelling units, whereas before, that was left to each individual community to decide, right? And the state can do that, right? Because they're kind of the superseding legislative body. But to a large extent, they've left that decision-making with you guys, right? So to the extent that they've left that to you, as long as it doesn't conflict with a state law, then you're good, right? So if you were to say, for instance, no ADUs allowed in Francis City, that would be illegal. You can't do that, right? And as far as for the matters that they have given you that discretion, right? Setbacks, height, uses, zones, lot sizes, stuff like that. The only question the court will ask is, was the decision the council made reasonably debatable that it was in the public interest, right? The courts have never said no to that question, right? So you guys have a lot of discretion, frankly, right? To kind of decide what people do with their land, which means you have a pretty big responsibility, right? To make sure that you're trying to strike that right balance of ensuring that people can do productive, economically useful things with their property while also creating a good community, right? And that sometimes can be a hard thing to do. And in that decision-making process, it's important to remember that your advisory committee is who? It's the planning commission, right? These guys are we kind of refer to them as a technical advisory commission, right? So you're supposed to look at it from a technical standpoint, from maybe a little more unbiased standpoint, and try to say, hey, what's the right place for these types of uses? Does this make sense from a provision of infrastructure standpoint, right? Because it's the city council, they're the ones who kind of look more at the policy and the politics side of things, right? You want to go to the next slide? I always forget to advance slides. I just start prattling.
Yeah. One quick, just.
Yeah, if you have questions, raise your hand or jump in or tell me to stop,
Yeah.
stop talking along the way, so.
I was just gonna say, at the top of my staff reports in the title section, I always put what type of decision it is. So if you're curious, is this a legislative or an administrative decision? Just look at the top of that report and you'll see what type of decision we're making.
Yeah, and these next slides kind of explain why that's so important, right? So when you're making legislative decisions, what can you consider, right? Like I said, you can't violate the law, reasonably debatable. You should attempt to strike that balance. You want to go to the next one? Okay, so this is kind of one of the bigger distinctions, right? You're going to have people who are going to come to your meetings, and they're going to have opinions about what they want their community to look like. Invite them and encourage them to come when you're making legislative decisions, because that's when you can consider their opinions, right? Their preferences. If they come, they say, hey, we don't want a gas station on the corner of the State Road and Main Street, right? If you're in the legislative decision-making process, you should consider that. And you should say, okay, what kind of zoning do we want throughout the town, right? Where do we want residential? Where do we want commercial if we have that? Where do we want industrial? Where do we want agricultural, right? When you're making those types of decisions, you should be receiving public input and you should be listening to the public and taking into consideration their opinions. You don't have to just give into a wholesale, right? You guys have to decide what's best for the community and whether or not what the people are saying represents the opinion of the entire community, right? but you're in a stage where you're weighing and determining credibility and listening to input from the public. Next one. That all changes when we get into administrative decision making. Okay. So over on the administrative decision, well, any questions about legislative decision making or that process at this point? Or thoughts or war stories, additional insight to add? Okay. Jump in at any time. You don't have to listen to me the whole time. When you get into administrative decision making, so now we're talking about people who are bringing in an application and saying, I want to use my land and I want to make sure my project complies with the rules that are in place, right? So at that point, you're asking you're asking different questions, essentially, right? And like Rob said, whereas for legislative decision-making, the ultimate decision maker is always the city council, on administrative decisions, it's the designated quote-unquote land use authority who's making the decision. So we're talking about subdivisions, conditional use permits, site plans, building permits, sometimes or variances, and sometimes development agreements that don't implement new rules, right? So all the things where they're just bringing in an application and you're making sure that it complies with the rules, right? So the person who makes that decision, it could be designated as the city council, except for subdivisions now, right? City council has been taking that out of the realm of subdivisions. And that's what Rob was talking about when he was talking about the administrative land use authority, right? But for conditional use permits, for commercial site plans, for building permits, arguably, right, you can still designate yourselves, city council, as the land use authority. But you can also designate the planning commission, you can designate your city engineer, you can designate your planner, right? For any given application, your reporter could do it, right? An individual could do it. You want that job, yeah?
No.
That's what I do.
You can designate anyone to do that, and state law does not require you to ever have a public hearing on an administrative item. If your local code says that you do, then you need to, but these guys can take that out of the local code as well, right? That an administrative decision needs a public hearing, if you have that in there.
What do you guys recommend on that?
That's a great question. What do we recommend as far as public hearings on administrative items? My opinion, everyone has their own opinion about it, right? I'd say the general best practice is that most of the time, public hearings are counterproductive for administrative items largely because the public isn't well trained enough to understand what their role is. So they'll get up and they'll say, to use my prior example, right? We don't want that gas station on the corner of Main Street and State Road, right? But if the zoning in place, when they submitted their application, says that gas stations are allowed there, you're not worried about that anymore. You're not asking the question, do we want this there anymore? You're just asking, does their application, their site plan for a gas station, comply with all the rules that are in our code, right? And so if the commercial one zone, which is the zone we're talking about theoretically, says gas stations are allowed, then they're allowed to do a gas station, and they just have to make sure they have all the required parking, they're putting all their pumps where they're supposed to be, they have their permits from the state, they have proper access, right? Their building meets all the standards for design guidelines. And the moment that they comply, the land use authority is obligated to say yes, right? And so the public coming up and sharing their opinion that this isn't the right place for this and we shouldn't allow this, right? They often feel like you're ignoring them when they sit back down and you move forward with reviewing the application, right? Now, if you can train the public well, they actually could play a really good role in certain cases, I think, for administrative items, like on conditional use permits, for instance, right? Like if someone comes up and says, hey, I don't know if you're aware, but Farmer Brown has an irrigation ditch that runs through the property right here, right? That's an important fact that needs to be understood and considered in deciding how this area is going to develop, right? So if the public is there, go ahead.
I was just wondering, based on the fact that you said when the public comes out at that time,
Yeah.
After the decision is being made,
right.
What time is best for the public to be involved?
At the legislative decision-making process.
Okay.
Yep. Which again, it's hard because no one cares when you're doing the
No
legislative.
one cares.
And so, you know, and that's a problem that every community deals with. I remember for a time back in the day, I worked as a city planner in Linden City, down in Utah County. And we were always trying to figure out, how can we get people interested in land use before there's a building coming up behind our house, right? Because that's when people get interested in land use, is when something's going in the empty field next to them, right?
Right.
We try to get them interested before that, and it's hard. There's no silver bullet on how to do that, other than trying to educate and let the community know, hey, when we're coming up with our general plan, when we're coming up with zoning, these are gonna affect you down the road, you should come to the meetings.
But the people who were coming, they weren't living there, they didn't know.
Yeah. And that's another important consideration, right? And that's something, as planning commissioners and city council members, I mean, you bring up a really good point that's kind of a big discussion item right now in land use, right? Are we properly considering future residents, right? And what their interests are, and how they're going to have housing, for instance, right? And what their uses are going to be. And again, it's hard to tell you specifically what's right and what's wrong. And that's why you guys ran and were elected and get to make those wonderful decisions. Thank you for your service. But you should be taking into consideration all this kind of stuff, right? And try and make a community that everyone can be proud of. So, good questions.
I know some of the examples that I've used in the past are, you know, like, take a sport, for example, there's gonna be, you know, rules and regulations, of course, that are gonna be in place, right? You know, whether it's football or soccer or basketball, I mean, it doesn't really matter. There's rules that are gonna be in place, and regardless of when any of those players may have joined that team or even learned about that sport or whatnot, there was already rules that were existing that they need to learn. That doesn't mean that the rules are always gonna be those rules, right? I would argue that defensive holding is gonna look different next year than it does this year. I'll just leave it at that right now. Yeah. But you can have rules, of course, that are gonna change over time, right? As there may be a desire and discussion for that. But those rules that are in place when someone comes into the game or is learning the game, those are the rules that are gonna be. Yeah, you apply those rules as they are, with the full understanding that the legislative body and the community at large has the ability to change rules as you're moving forward, but rules that apply at the time that whenever something is being done. Like someone brings in an application, what are the rules that are in place today that they bring that application? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an important rule in Utah, right, is that you can't change the rules midstream on an application. So once someone brings in their application, they're vested. If you look at it and say, oof, we made a really bad choice here, right? That guy gets through, right? But for the next one, you can change the rules, right?
Is there a precedent because of that? Where it becomes muddy?
Maybe from like a community standpoint, right? And people getting mad at you
But
standpoint,
not the law.
but there's no legal precedent. Yeah, good question.
So we go back to sports and say there's not a rule.
John always has this good sports.
It's always a sports thing, and it's always anti-New England Patriots. Sorry.
Sorry, that's too loud. You have something over here?
Yeah, I don't want to jump ahead, if you're
Jump away.
if you're gonna cover this later, but one of the things that's, that we're all wrestling with currently is a conditional use.
Okay,
So maybe you're already gonna talk about this, but if not, can you
yeah,
cover
absolutely.
the difference between an allowed use versus a conditional use and how those things can be waived?
Yeah,
And when they can or cannot be denied.
yeah. So conditional use,
Should or should not.
it's a great example. Sorry, John.
No, oh, yeah.
We can use that as an example, right, for administrative decision making. So let's just talk about conditional uses, right? We didn't have any slides on that.
We do right now, and if you wanted to,
Do you want me to jump?
you could if you want. It's kind of lays out some of the basics.
We can cover it later if we're gonna
Let me
go there.
jump into it in just a second.
Yeah, that's fine.
Before we get there, so to kind of wrap up just kind of the general administrative decision-making process, right? So whereas before, a court would look at a decision made on the legislative side and just ask, hey, is this reasonably available if it's in public interest, right? On the administrative side, they'll say, okay, number one, is it legal? Which now you're not only looking at federal and state law, you're looking at your local ordinances, right? So if the local ordinances say this complies and you say denied, then you've made a legal decision, an illegal decision, right? In addition, anytime you're making some sort of a factual determination or exercising discretion, right? It can't just be that, well, we think this is the best choice, right? You actually have to support your decision at that point with what we call substantial evidence. Some good, credible, relevant, factual evidence, right? So if you're gonna require someone, for instance, to build a certain road at a certain width, for instance, right? You should have an opinion, right, or some data from your city engineer saying that that type of a road is necessary for the proposed development, for instance, right? You can't just say, well, we want this size of a road, right? You have to support your decision with some good evidence that's usually from an expert, that's factual, that's relevant, that's credible, right? As opposed to just reasonably debatable to be in the public interest. Does that make sense, the distinction there?
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? I think people are used to evidentiary standards for like criminal court or
Yes.
for civil court, but this is a
Is this
different
our champion in
standard.
the room?
Maybe one of them. But, so could you elaborate on that a bit more to help us understand, what does that mean? Like, what's insubstantial evidence versus substantial? What's the threshold, the quantity of evidence we need to have?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's pretty low, to be completely honest, right? So you could have, okay, so we talk about preponderance, you know, clear and convincing, beyond reasonable doubt. Those are like up here beyond 50%, and we're not supposed to attach percentages, right? But like it's up here, like you have a lot of evidence, right? Substantial evidence is if we're using like this, right? And we're up here with the preponderance and clear and convincing and those types of things. Substantial evidence is somewhere over here, right? In other words, let's say you have two city engineers and one city engineer says, hey, this is gonna make the road become, it's gonna cause the road to fail, like from a service standpoint, right? And the other did I say attorney or engineer? And the other engineer says, produces a report that says, oh no, things are gonna be fine, right? Like it's gonna be fine with this width, right? Or you have engineers who are talking about sewer lines. Well, we need an 8-inch. No, actually, they could be fine with a 4-inch or whatever, right? If you have good, credible, relevant, expert evidence that goes both directions, the decision maker gets to choose which one to rely on, and that is substantial evidence, right? So again, the key here is that you're relying on some good, credible, relevant, usually expert-based evidence, recognizing that with land use and engineering, you can hopefully attest to this, there's often a range of opinions that can come into play, right? About what is going to be the best infrastructure to provide the right infrastructure, right? So first and foremost, you need to follow what your ordinances say and your development standards. But where there is discretion, or you got to make a decision about is the line about to fail and it needs to be expanded, or is it sufficient, or whatever, right? You can't just make a decision because you want to make it. You have to rely on some good evidence. So you're turning to an expert and you're relying on the evidence they provide. But you get to decide, right, which expert you listen to. And that's kind of the discretion that substantial evidence standard gives you in making that decision. Is that helpful?
No, that's very helpful. And one other question with that. So this is the evidentiary standard whether we go either way, correct?
Correct.
So if we say yes or no, we're subject to the same standard.
On administrative decisions, yep. Yeah, so if you make an administrative decision to deny, then you should have some evidence to support why you're denying. Yep. And same the other way, right? If you're gonna approve, you need some substantial evidence for why you're approving. Yep.
I'll usually recommend for people, you want to have some type of math or metric that you can point to, some type of reasoning. So if someone completely on the outside were to say, why did you choose to support this? You know, like the part of the example that Jordan used, like an 8-inch line. You could say, well, because the math showing X amount of units that are being proposed here are going to require X amount of runoff, and here's how big this pipe would need to be in order to carry that pipe. Totally substantial evidence. What would be insubstantial evidence if you were to say something like, I think it should be 10-inch line. Why? Just because we have 10-inch lines in other areas.
Because there's a lot of people out there.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. You wouldn't have any type of metric or anything that a third party totally outside could come and look at and go, that seems reasonable. And that's why you see the term reasonable or reasonably debatable a lot of times in planning as well.
Sufficient to convince a reasonable mind to support a position.
Even reasonable mind is reasonably debatable.
If you have any questions, I am designated as the reasonable mind in my family, so.
Okay.
Good questions. Any other questions or thoughts about that part of it? Okay. What does the next slide say? Okay, yeah, oh, all right, so yeah, we're making administrative decisions, right? We're talking about applying the plain language of the land use regulations, so this is kind of important to talk about. The third bullet down, when a regulation does not plainly restrict the land use application or could reasonably be read, there's that word again, right? To support different interpretations, the land use authority must interpret and apply the regulation to favor the proposal in the land use application. So you kind of sometimes get into this conversation of how to interpret the code, right? If two people can read the code and draw different conclusions, that means it's ambiguous, right? And if you have an ambiguous provision that can be read two different ways by two people, you know, often, and in certain areas of the law, you interpret in favor of the enforcer or something like that, right? In other cases, you interpret in favor of the person being enforced upon. When we talk about property rights, you interpret in favor of the property owner's desired use. So the courts have said that because zoning ordinances restrict the free use of land, we're gonna interpret them narrowly, right? And so the message there is say what you want to say in your ordinances, right? I've been in communities where they've said, well, hey, let's make this a little vague so that when someone comes in, we can decide how to interpret it then. From a legal standpoint, that puts you in a risky place, right? Because if you do that and then it goes to court, then the court will say you should have interpreted that in favor of the use of property as opposed to the restriction of property, right? So the lesson and the best practice is be specific, right? And be very clear as you can in your ordinances so that everyone can read it and understand what is being required. And then there's that substantial evidence standard that we talked about, right? So it must be factual, credible, and relevant. And then evidence that a reasonable mind would accept is adequate to support a conclusion. So again, you can have two piles of evidence, and maybe this pile is this big using, you know, and then this pile is this big. If you feel like this is more credible and relevant to your situation, you can rely on that, right? But it is up to the decision maker to kind of weigh that evidence and decide which is the one to rely on. Does that make sense?
So can you make the distinction? It seems that more than likely, at least in my mind, the requirement to have substantial evidence is going to come into play more often when you're denying something. If you have an allowed use and there's an administrative decision to be made, if you're approving that, then it's probably because there's substantial evidence to support that it meets the code.
Sure.
I mean, that's just, if the planning commission has reviewed it and it meets the code and it gets approved,
Yeah.
then it,
Right.
nobody's gonna come to you and say, well, we need the substantial evidence.
Right. Some evidence is very black and white, right? Like if it's a 35-foot tall house, you go out and measure the house.
Right.
And then there's your evidence, right? But yeah.
Versus a time when you would maybe deny a project or a land use, that substantial evidence may come into play, it seems more often than not, because the land use or the applicant's going to say, well, you denied me, I believe that I provided substantial evidence that you should have approved this.
Yeah.
And that's when the battle happens. Is that, am I?
No, you're absolutely right. That's a good observation, right? And it's kind of depending on the relation, on which relationship we're talking about. Between the city and the applicant, yes, when you deny, you want to make sure that you are putting in the record very clear and good substantial evidence about why you made your decision, right?
Right.
At the same time, if you have a controversial land use, right, that a lot of people have come out for, that you've approved, and there might be neighbors who are going to challenge it, the same thing applies, right? You want to make sure that you have really good and clear and relevant substantial evidence in the record, which is a requirement across the board, right? The courts have actually been pretty clear about that lately, that remember back in math class, I told my 16-year-old every day, show your work, right? Yeah. And that's what you have to do with administrative decisions. You have to You want to show your work, right? This is why we made the decision we made. Here are the codes that we reviewed. This is the interpretation. You know, here are the requirements we put in place, and here's the evidence to support why we put those requirements in place, right? And impose those conditions, right, for conditional uses and things like that. But you're right, from a practical standpoint, if it's a pretty non-controversial thing and you're approving, there's probably not many people who are going to be challenging that, right? Or if you have an applicant who wants their use and you're denying, then yeah, you want to make sure that you're very clear if you want to decrease your exposure to the risk of being that decision being challenged.
I had two quick questions for you. So I was looking for advisory opinions, and it seems like recently a lot of the advisory opinions, strangely enough, in Summit County, are citizens suing their government for approving conditional use permits that they weren't happy with. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is. Good observation. Yeah, and I mean, it comes and it goes, right? Usually it's the high growth communities where we get a lot of third party challenges, of which Summit County is one, right? And so, yeah, and it's becoming more and more of a thing just as growth increases and people live closer together, you see more and more of those third party challenges.
And then related to that, because I mean, it seems like we're in a situation where we might get sued either way. Is fear of suit evidence that supports either approving or denying a conditional use permit?
No.
It shouldn't be, yeah.
Yeah, from a legal standpoint, no, right?
Okay.
But yeah,
I,
that's a tough one, right?
Yeah, if I could just add, I think, you know, over the years, as I have worked with, you know, so many conditional use permits and a lot of communities, I've seen communities make decisions to limit the amount of conditional uses that they have out there for that exact reason, to try to be more proactive as far as trying to really then have as much of that black and white in place as possible, so that there is, these are permitted uses, these are non-permitted uses, because the broader scope that you have on, these are permitted, but they're conditional, right? Then you get into that area of, you have to have a lot of really good evidence to support why you're either going to approve a conditional use permit with certain conditions put on it, or deny one regardless of what conditions were being proposed to do that. It can end up being really, really subjective. And that's where a lot of that challenge can come in. So I've certainly seen over the years that we, you know, ebb and flow in the use of conditional use permits for that. I would say that was one of the major driving reasons for a lot of communities.
Just that risk.
Yeah. That's a good segue. So, what's the next one say?
Considerations when making.
Or the next slide, sorry.
Just following.
Okay, yes, and I think we kind of talked about all this.
Okay.
Where were let's find the ones on conditional use permits.
Yeah, these should,
Here we go.
There we go, we're back.
Okay, so conditional use permits, getting into that, right? I think they can be challenged a lot because there is some subjectivity, frankly, right? In how you impose conditions sometimes. And you want to make that process as objective as possible. In other words, where someone will look at it and say, yeah, this was the right decision, everyone will agree with it, as opposed to a subjective decision that's based upon kind of perceptions and preferences, right? So the whole premise behind a conditional use permit is that, backing up, right, in our codes we have permitted uses, and then we have non-permitted uses. And usually in what we call Euclidean zoning, right, kind of traditional zoning, you have a list of permitted uses. So a residential zone might say single family, two family, triplexes, and that's it, right? And then there will be a line that says all other uses not herein articulated or otherwise prohibited, right? So that means you have those permitted uses. You can also have a list of, and those permitted uses, if they comply with the code, you're good, right? So there's this recognition that there are unusual uses, the courts have referred to them, right? Or conditional uses. So I have a list here from a treatise I was reading the other day. It's examples of unusual uses for which conditional use designation may be warranted, right? So think about this as you're thinking about your code, right? You may have too many things designated as conditional uses if they're not uses that have unusual condition or characteristics for that area, right? So it has things like airports, religious uses, churches, right? They tend to operate more commercially as far as parking and things like that and attendance, right? But it's something that you want in a residential area. People like having churches in residential areas, but they have unusual characteristics as compared to residential uses, right? Recreational facilities, schools, hospitals, drug treatment centers, be careful with those, right? Because you also got fair housing and disability considerations. Childcare facilities, gas stations, landfills, gun ranges and clubs, junkyards and dog kennels. So those are all things that, yeah, we need a place for them, right? But where we typically have them, they have unusual characteristics. And so the idea behind a conditional use is that in certain cases, maybe we need to impose additional requirements on those uses, right? Like Rob said, a lot of jurisdictions and best practices will tell you to move away from conditional use permits, especially if every time one comes in, you're imposing the same conditions. If permit after permit, you're imposing the same conditions, and you just have like this boilerplate template, take that and put it into your ordinance and say, you gotta make sure you do all these things. And then just turn it into a permitted use, right? Because then that permitted use has to comply with those requirements before they're approved, right? But if you have things that come in very infrequently, right? Yeah, you don't deal with a lot, and maybe in every given part of town, they're gonna be a little different. Those are the ones where you look at and say, yeah, maybe it makes sense here to designate it as a condition of permitted use. And then when you do that, they have to comply with the code. And then additionally, you go through this process, right, of identifying their reasonably anticipated detrimental effects. So you have to identify those, and then you can impose reasonable conditions to mitigate those detrimental effects in accordance with standards in your ordinance. So if you go to the next slide, I pulled these, I think, from Harriman City. These are some examples of standards, right? So you can, they don't impose specific requirements, they just give you things to consider in an application, right? Impact to street service levels and or traffic patterns, impact on utility systems and service delivery, connectivity and pedestrian safety, noise, odor, and environmental impacts, hours of operation, signs or exterior lighting compatibility, emergency services. So you have to have these standards in your ordinance, right? And then if there's a standard that says you can consider these things based upon the characteristics of the use that's being proposed, then you can take that standard and say, okay, in light of that standard and the evidence that we have, we are going to say that you need to build this facility, right? If you do that, then you can impose that condition, right? But if you want to impose a condition that doesn't relate to one of these standards or isn't supported by some good evidence, you cannot impose that condition, right? So it has to be related to a standard in your ordinance, and it has to be supported by substantial evidence. And that's where people often get in trouble, right? Is they impose conditions that don't relate to one of their standards or isn't supported by evidence. And so when making decisions on conditional use permits, you want to make sure you're going through that process very carefully of, does it comply with the code? Have we identified reasonably anticipated detrimental effects? And do we feel like we need to mitigate? You don't have to mitigate them, right? But if we do want to mitigate them, is there a standard that allows us to? And the requirement we're imposing as a result of that standard, is it supported by substantial evidence? Have I lost everyone? Does that make sense? Is that helpful? So just make sure you go through that process, right? Show your work in imposing those conditions if you're going to impose conditions. Because if you're just saying, this doesn't look the way I want it to, and the way I want it to look would require these conditions, then you're going to get in a lot of trouble, right? And those are the ones that often get challenged, for instance. So, any specific questions or thoughts on conditional uses?
Yeah, I want to I have a question. In your statements, you said, we as a city, in our code, we have allowed a certain building to be built.
Yeah.
But you say it has to meet all of our codes.
Yeah.
If it doesn't meet all of our codes, is that grounds to deny a conditional use permit?
if it doesn't meet your codes, you are required to deny it.
We are required.
You are required, yeah, so there's a provision in state law that says the local government must follow the mandatory provisions of its ordinances. It goes both ways, right? The property owner has to follow the local ordinances, and the city has to follow the local ordinances. So if a use is being proposed that does not comply with the plain requirement in your ordinance, then you need to deny it, right?
And we can legally do that.
Yes.
Because obviously we're gonna get pushback.
Yes, right. Yeah, and now, let's say you're looking at it and you say, oh man, our code doesn't allow this, but, you know, this actually would be a good thing for our community, or, I don't think this is the right balance, I think this is restricting property rights too much, right? Then you could go through the legislative process to change your ordinances, and then the applicant can come back and they can go through the process again, right? And get approved that way. But as far as what the rules say, so yeah, and you bring up a good point, right? You can't add rules to the code, but you also can't take out rules of the code without going through the formal process of changing the ordinances.
So what if the applicant already submitted?
Say that again, sorry.
What if I've already submitted my application
Uh-huh.
and then you realize that it doesn't align with what you,
What the code says.
yes.
Yep.
And you want to go change it.
Uh-huh.
Does my application still stand?
It can, yeah, and this is.
Because you're saying we can come back.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to come back. I've already submitted this.
Yeah, so.
I'm not going to wait for you to change it. How does that apply?
If they're not willing to wait and they want a decision right then and there, and the code says you're not permitted, and they want a decision, then you have to say deny.
No, but what if I'm permitted?
If you're permitted,
Mhm.
then they have to say approved.
Okay.
So again,
But
everyone.
what if your structure violates some of our other city codes that we have written?
Right, so you have to comply with all the codes.
Yeah.
Right? So if you bring in an application and yeah, the use is allowed, but you can't meet the parking requirement, or you're not meeting the height requirement, right? Or you're not meeting setbacks or whatever, right? Then that's when the city council has denial or grounds for denying the application. Now, I don't know if you were talking about this, but sometimes the question comes up of, okay, well, when someone brings in their application, that locks in the rules that apply to their application. They obtain a vested right, right? In what the application says. If the city, in negotiating with that property owner, says, you know what, we actually, we should probably loosen up the rules, change the rules to allow this, right? So if you change the rules while their application is still pending, they can opt into those new rules. Vested rights protect property owners. They don't protect the city. The city can't use a vested right to tell an applicant, well, yeah, we changed our rules later, but you have to follow the old rules, right? They can always opt into the new rules. And I don't know if that was what you were talking about, but that's something to consider, right? Is if they bring in an application, and sometimes that starts a conversation, right? And you look at it and you say, man, maybe we should allow a gas station. I'll just stick with that one, right? A gas station on the corner of Main Street. Then, you know, you can go through the process of amending your code to allow gas stations or change it to a zoning designation that allows gas stations. And then the next meeting or that same meeting even, you can come back and say, okay, let's move your application forward now that it complies. Does that make sense?
You can't force an applicant to do that, but the applicant can choose.
Right, yeah.
But let's discuss just a little bit more, let's say, because this is similar to the situation that we're all wrestling with currently.
The gas station.
You have a gas station, yeah, you have a gas station, it's in a commercial zone, but it's a conditional use versus just an allowed use. That's where I think the real challenge comes in with the conditional use permit, because it seems that, at least from what I've heard so far, is in order to just flat out deny the use, because even though it's a conditional use,
Yep.
to deny that use, you would have to have the substantial evidence that the impact can't be mitigated based on the things in the code.
Right.
But it can't be subjective.
Right. Yeah, and
That's what I
that's
think
what we
is
haven't
the
talked about yet,
challenge.
right, is how do you deny a conditional use permit, right? So let's say you identify reasonably anticipated detrimental effects. Number one, if you can't identify detrimental effects, then you don't get imposed conditions, right? But if you are able to identify detrimental effects that relate to the standards in your ordinance, and you can't reasonably mitigate those detrimental effects, then state law says you can deny the application, right? But if you can come up with, or even the applicant can propose reasonable conditions to mitigate meaning not eliminate, right, but lessen.
Right.
If they can propose conditions, or you can come up with conditions that kind of that mitigate, that lessen the impact of those unusual characteristics, then you're still in that realm of you're obligated to approve, and they're entitled to approval, right? It's only in the case when you actually can look at it and say, hey man, there's detrimental effects here that it doesn't matter what condition we impose, they're going to be like really, they're going to have a substantial and detrimental effect to the neighboring uses. And in that case, you can deny. For many, many years, we have never had an example of a court upholding the denial of a conditional use permit. Just a couple years ago, for the first time, the Court of Appeals upheld the denial of a conditional use permit in the Springdale area. And it was, I don't know why the zoning was the way it was, but it was a parking lot, right, where people would park at to go into Zions in like the middle of this residential neighborhood, right? So they looked at and said, like, the traffic coming in and out, like the surrounding uses, the land use authority looked at that and said, there's no way to mitigate this in a way that doesn't have a substantial and detrimental effect on the surrounding uses. So we're going to deny, and the court upheld it. The court said that was okay.
Is it ever considered to, like, the value of the surrounding areas? You know, that's a normal question
Yeah.
for homeowners to say, all right, you drop a parking lot in the middle here, we have 1 million cars now, my house is worth $1 million, now it's worth
It's
600,000.
going to impact property value, yeah. I mean, that can be a consideration. I think you're not shaking ground if you make that the only consideration, right? Because you want to focus on use, right?
But community members, that's the first place they go.
That's the first place they'll go, absolutely, right? And there's nothing that says you can't take into account that, right? But I would probably make sure you have a lot more than that.
Yeah, because there are certain areas of land use that will actually say that economics cannot be a sole reason.
Like variances.
Well, adversely, a lot of times, by people doing certain things, it brings the community values.
Yeah.
And speaking frankly and practically, right, I mean, that is a stated purpose of zoning, right, is to try to preserve and promote property value. Right? So.
But you have to have substantial evidence that that would happen.
Exactly. Look at this, we're all experts now.
So it's a difference of, if it's zoned a certain way, and it's been, the applicant comes in, it's permitted, it doesn't matter what anybody thinks or how mad the neighbor is, you're good to go.
As long as you comply with the ordinance.
But a lot of the zoning say, if you're zoned this way with, as long as you meet all our conditional use permits, it's not like a straightforward, you're good to go, the council still has to review.
Yeah.
And give it a proper thumbs up.
Right.
And you're saying there's only been one time where somebody, the council denied something,
And the court upheld it.
and they're because, so people just come back and say, well, I don't like that it got denied, we're gonna keep asking.
Yeah, as a practical matter, I would treat a conditional use as a permitted use that you can impose a few reasonable conditions on. If you identify detrimental effects and do it in accordance with your standards, right? For all intents and purposes, assume, if you put a conditional use in your ordinance, expect that that use is going to be approved, right? If you don't want that, if you potentially don't want that anywhere in that zone, take it out, right? Because, yeah, you treat it as a permitted use that you can impose a few conditions on. That's the best way to look at it, especially from a legal standpoint.
But if you find a city code that you feel negates that conditional use, you have to deny it.
I would say not just that you feel, right, but that you know.
Well,
Yeah.
you reasonably read that.
Sorry,
Yeah, you have the essence.
I'm the attorney.
Right. No, well, and
No
that's
feelings.
what's ambiguous, right?
Yeah, okay, if it's ambiguous, that's a great point. That honestly goes back to our prior conversation, right? It can be read to approve the application, you should be approving it, right? So that's why I say, if it's clear that the application violates that provision, that's when you're on solid ground that you need to deny the application.
But that doesn't have to be, like you're talking about, a metric, like, say you can't have this within 1,000 feet of this. It can be, you shall not allow this if this happens. Like, is that ambiguous, or is that plain speech?
It sounds plain. It's hard to answer those questions
Right.
theoretically, right? But yeah, I mean, again, if the plain language clearly restricts is the best way to put it, right? So the plain language clearly restricts, deny.
It's like an administrative here, not legislative.
Absolutely, yeah, we're totally in an administrator right now, right? Yeah, so if someone comes in and requests a zone change, right? Conversation is completely different. You can say, we don't want to change the zone here because we don't think it's best for the community, period, and everyone walks out of it, right?
But like a height change, that'd be a variance inside of that ask.
Say again?
If the zoning allows for the, the gas station.
Yeah.
But they want to make it, 20 feet taller than is allowed. Then under that, would that be the variance underneath the conditional use? So if they're asking you to say, hey, I need to do this at this height inside of this zone.
Okay, so if the height restriction is 35 feet, and there's nothing in the code that allows for an exception to that height limit, and they're not willing to go, and they're showing 50 feet, then you have to deny, right? Or change your ordinances, right? But you can also build, I've hit a chord, I think. You can also build discretion into your code, right? So like, to your point, right? Like if you want to say, hey, if such and such criteria are met, then we can allow for an additional height, right? And you look at those criteria and you say, yep, all of these criteria are met, and you support that with substantial evidence, then you can allow the exception, right? But you have to follow your code in doing that. Does that make sense? You can't just
And if
say,
it does have exceptions spelled out,
then you can't.
But like residentially, you don't want everybody coming in here saying, well, I really want a 38-foot house, not 35.
Yeah.
The pitch look better.
Yeah.
It's just a hard and fast.
and you use the term variance too, and I think oftentimes many members of the community just think, well, if I'm being told that I can't do whatever I want to do, I'm just going to ask for variance. And variances should actually be very infrequent within communities because there is really specific criteria that needs to go along with them that, they're not based in just the economics of something. They're not just designed because someone wants to do something. It has to be something that the strict interpretation of the code. Yeah. Exactly. Something that doesn't apply to all of the other properties that are within that same zone, but that don't allow a property owner to do something that everyone else is permitted to do, but they're not because of something unique within that land that is not of their own doing, right?
Because the slopes are over 30% on 90% of my lot, my building envelope is so small that I can't build anything on it, right? Building something on a residential lot is a property right that everyone else in the zone enjoys, and so maybe you need to adjust your setback.
So that person has a variance may be permitted to exceed a height or
And that was
setback.
that will come in front of the council to determine all your evidence as to why, and then it allows them to rule on that.
Or whoever the land use authority is.
Yes, go for it.
All right, so
You've been waiting patiently.
let's just say you had like 5 parts of your code that say one thing.
I love these hypothetical questions.
Very hypothetical. They say one thing, but then you have another sentence somewhere that kind of says something different. Doesn't align. Do you hang your hat on that one that doesn't align, or do you follow the 4 that do, 4 or 5?
Gosh darn it, that's a good question. And it's way too hypothetical
I know.
for me to give a clear answer, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to read them all and you try. Okay, so there's like this process you
How
go
do we
through
handle
in
that?
interpretation, right? It's like you look at the plain language. If the plain language is clear, then you go with that, right? If there's ambiguity, then you move on to,
So plain language is like the first thing you look at.
Yeah, and you try to make sure that all provisions, if you can reconcile them and make everything, meaningful, then you go with that interpretation, right? So if you have that situation, my first advice is change it quick.
Right.
But for that application for which you have to make a decision, I mean, honestly and sincerely, I would say consult your attorney.
Okay.
Right? And have them come up with an interpretation that you can then rely on, right?
Which then is that substantial evidence that you're using as staff for your administrative decision.
Okay, thank you, that's good advice.
So going back to that decision in Springdale, so my recollection is that there was part of the code in the Springdale City Code that talked about, and I can't remember exactly, it's something about considering people's ability to use or enjoy their property. And they didn't really couch their arguments in terms of property values, but they couched their arguments in terms of how privacy would be destroyed in certain things, and that would detrimentally affect their ability to use their property. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, I think so. And let me caveat this, just being frank, right? The land use community was incredibly surprised by that decision. I think most land use practitioners would have said that that application, based upon prior practice and what we understood state law to be, should have been approved, right? And there's nothing to say that if that were to go to the Supreme Court, they might agree, right? But we do have that one case where the appellate courts have said, for the reasons you kind of outlined, it's been a while since I read it, so you probably have a fresher in mind than I do, but yeah, for those reasons, they did deny it, and it was upheld on substantial evidence, so.
Can we use
But
that
it
as
was-
precedent? Is that something that we should?
That is precedent, right? And so, yeah, if you're gonna deny an application, I would definitely go consult that case and say, okay, is our situation similar to this situation, right? And do we have similar amounts of evidence? Are we using, equally credible rationale for why we're doing things? Because that is precedent right now, and it hasn't been overturned, so. Your questions? Okay, it's usually around the hour mark that people get tired of listening to the attorney go on and on.
Well, we've been tired of that for a long time.
I'm a non-attorney, I just like to point that out.
Okay, I'll turn the time back over to Rob.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, we're happy to talk about anything else you guys want to talk about, or we can call it quits if you guys are ready to call it quits. What do you think? Do you want to put up the very last slide? Maybe let's do that.
Yeah, we're at 24:30, so we have exactions and then.
Well, just go to the very last one.
Okay.
So
We call this our Jeopardy board, which is
Yeah.
usually just kind of hot topics, things that we
just
get called
remember, if you
questions
see
about.
anything on there that you want to talk about before we end, and or any other topic that is just burning a hole in your mind right now. If not, then it's up to you guys when we stop. So.
I will say though, that any questions for any of the items up here, the answer will start with, it depends. But then we can talk about it more.
And that's coming from the flagger. See, the attorney didn't say it.
Yes.
When we were talking about the potentially detrimental effects.
Yeah.
Right? How is it established that something is a potentially detrimental effect?
With substantial evidence.
That's what's required, right?
Yeah, every finding that you make, right, along that path that we talked about of considering a conditional use permit needs to be supported by some good evidence, right? So a reasonably anticipated detrimental effect, if it's not clear and obvious that it is, right, you need to support it with some good evidence for why whatever characteristic we're talking about is a detrimental effect. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, but when it comes to collecting evidence that supports two sides of that equation, right?
Yeah.
If, with respect to the gas station and the feeling that in that hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
And the feeling, okay, well, there might be a feeling that this is the right location for it, right? Whose job is it to collect this evidence in support of both directions? If that makes sense, right?
Yeah. So ultimately, the land use authority, the decision maker, they have the obligation to support their decision with substantial evidence, right? Now, it is appropriate to, if you're keeping it reasonable, right, to ask the applicant to go gather some of that evidence, right? For you to make a decision on. Is that
Some,
make sense?
like as a common
Like,
example, say with a gas station, right? Someone comes in with a site plan, here's what they're thinking about doing. And the immediate concern may be for lighting, where you're having your lighting setting up here and you're right next to a residential area, there's concern that there's going to be a significant amount of light that's going to spread over into these residences. totally appropriate for the land use authority at that time to say to the applicant that you need to be able to show that you can direct or hood this lighting away to an acceptable degree per the standards that we have within our code, right? The lighting standards that are already there. Noise is another very common one, right? They have to say certain operations need to cease by X time at night, or always have to be below a certain decibel level. Those are the substantial areas of evidence that the applicant would then need to be able to say, here are the things that I'm going to do to ensure that I can mitigate those items, whether it's conditional use permit or not, in all honesty. Here's your standard, and right now mine goes up here, but if I put hoods on those lights and direct the light down 30 degrees, then it's gonna come down here, now it's gonna meet that standard, and there's your substantial evidence.
Another example I like to use is traffic, right? So if someone brings in an application and you look at it and say, man, these are a lot of units, or this is a pretty intensive use, you can say, can you go get a traffic study so that we can determine whether or not, the traffic you're gonna have here is gonna have a detrimental effect. If they bring back a traffic study and it didn't really conclude what you thought it would conclude, then it's on you if you wanna go get another traffic study, for instance, right? So again, within reason, you can ask them to bring evidence to support their application. But if you don't like the evidence they're bringing, then, from a due process or reasonableness standpoint, then it's probably, the burden probably shifts to you guys, the decision maker, if you want to go find and get other evidence, right? Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good questions.
In the event that the council or the land use, whoever made
Yeah.
that decision, if you bring something in that supports what you want to do, and they have other things that say, well, actually, that's probably not. You've done your part, and others should say, well, actually, this study says no. For the traffic study, we have two traffic studies.
Yeah.
First one, we didn't get it. We did it again. We got it. Who wins, or what do they have to do?
So at that point, whoever the land use authority is has to decide which study is more credible and which one they're going to rely on. And sometimes it's not who's right, it's who's the last, right? And so,
Or is it just an average of data, or?
yeah, again, as long as they submit substantial evidence, they can be reliable. And keep in mind also, if you have one traffic study and it says one thing, and you don't have any other evidence or studies, then that's the only thing you can rely on, right? That's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah, you can't just say, well, I disagree.
Yeah, I
And
don't
that's
know.
it.
But I mean, to his point, at some level, in the adjudicative role, we're almost like the jury. Is that fair to say? Like, we're the decider of
Jury and
fact,
executioner.
right? I mean, we have to decide which evidence is credible, and
Yeah.
as long as it's substantial evidence, then.
Yeah, the great thing about that, of course, is the state law allows local communities to be able to have that deference and that control, right? But at the same time, it's like I tell my kids all the time, I have a 16 and a 19-year-old, right? And they're in such hurries to grow up, and I have to say to them all the time, be careful. Be careful what you ask for, because you also are going to be the one that gets to live with whatever those consequences.
It's the Spider-Man rule, right?
It is.
Great power comes great responsibility.